I want to ask you a question, and I want you to sit with it for a moment before you answer. And that question is this: what percentage of your skincare do you think is made from fossil fuels? I'm not talking about the packaging. I'm not talking about the shipping. I'm talking about the actual ingredients sitting inside your formulations. The ones that you weigh out if you're a formulator, the ones that your customers pay for if you're a beauty brand owner, the ones that sit on ingredient decks next to your lovely botanicals on your bathroom shelf. How much of all of that is at its root derived from petrochemicals? And if you don't know the answer, you're not alone, because nobody does. And I think that's one of the most significant things the beauty industry isn't talking about. So that's what I'm going to explore on the podcast today. Hi, it's Lorraine Dallmeier, chartered environmentalist, biologist, and the CEO of award-winning online organic cosmetic formulation school, Formula Botanica. I host the Green Beauty Conversations podcast, which has had well over 1 million global downloads. And these are my Green Beauty opinions, where I challenge you to think differently about the beauty industry. If you love hearing my thoughts on green beauty, make sure you subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode. Now, before I go any further and talk more about petrochemicals, I want to be very clear about something. I've talked about fossil fuels on this podcast before, and I've talked about plastics as well. And my position has always been the same, which is, and this might surprise you, that fossil fuels are not the villain in this story. In fact, I think they're one of the most remarkable things this planet has ever produced. You know, we're talking billions of years of stored solar energy, which is dense and versatile and genuinely extraordinary. And plastic as well. Plastic is an incredible human invention. The problem was never with the molecules. The problem has always been us, right? Our appetite for fossil fuels and petrochemicals, our laziness, our complete failure to ask whether we actually needed to use quite so much of it quite so carelessly. And I said this back in 2022 when we discussed plastic here on the podcast for Plastic Free July. And I'll say it again now. I think if we used fossil fuels responsibly, things would look very different. In fact, here's a position that might surprise you. I would far rather that we used fossil fuels to make functional, long-lasting chemistry than that we burned them for energy, because a molecule of petrolatum sitting in a jar isn't releasing carbon dioxide. The carbon is locked in. So I don't think that's the scandal. The scandal is the billions of tons that we set fire to every single day and release irreversibly into the atmosphere. And using a fraction of what we extract to make skincare ingredients is, relatively speaking, one of the more defensible things we can do with oil. But, and here's where I really want you to stay with me, that argument only holds if we actually understand what we're using, why we're using it, and whether we need to keep using it indefinitely. And right now, we can't even answer the first part of that question because no one has measured it. So I looked into this a little bit. Approximately 12 to 14% of global oil demand and 8% of natural gas demand are used as feedstocks for the petrochemical industry to produce plastics and fertilizers and other materials. And when I'm talking about those percentages, I'm talking about the whole world and the entire petrochemical industry. But when it comes to cosmetics and how much the beauty industry consumes in terms of fossil fuels for chemicals, to my knowledge, there is no industry-wide figure and no standardized disclosure. There's also no requirement for a brand to tell you what percentage of its formula is derived from petrochemical feedstocks. So the Environmental Working Group, and yes, I know they are slightly problematic in how they report things, but bear with me. They have a database that lists over 1,400 products that contain petrolatum alone. And that's just one ingredient, the obvious one, you know, the one with the giveaway name. When you start to look at the supply chains behind retinol and certain ceramides and alpha hydroxy acids and a long list of other actives that the industry has decided are non-negotiable for our skin, you'll find something that's much harder to see. Not petrochemical ingredients, but petrochemical processes like solvents and reagents and catalysts and heavy metals used in synthesis. The fossil fuel dependency isn't always in the final molecule that makes it onto your skin either. Sometimes it's buried in every step that it took to get there. And no one's required to tell you about any of that. The thing that I find most interesting about all of this is when you compare it to how we talk about other hidden supply chain issues in the beauty industry. Because as an industry, we have lengthy debates about palm oil and we scrutinize mica sourcing and we talk about traceability all the time and we interrogate packaging recyclability. And yet an ingredient category that by some estimates makes up the majority of what's in mainstream cosmetics exists almost entirely below the waterline. Beauty consumers are probably most likely not aware. If they knew, I think they'd probably ask questions. And the beauty industry knows that, which is perhaps why it's never felt particularly motivated to count. Now, I'm not asking the beauty industry to abandon synthetic chemistry tomorrow. That would neither be realistic nor in many cases necessary. What I'm asking is something much simpler. I think we need to start to measure. I think we require transparency about feedstock origins in the same way that we require transparency about other things. I think we need to stop treating "it's always been made this way" as a sufficient answer to the question of whether it needs to keep being made this way. Because the good news, and there is good news, is that alternatives are coming. Because as you heard on the podcast last week, when I interviewed Chris Valencius of Evolved by Nature, and make sure you listen to that episode if you haven't heard it yet, we talked about how biotech is doing things now that weren't possible 5 years ago. And the reason that those alternatives matter isn't because petrochemical ingredients are inherently evil, but because we now have options. And those options can also include upcycled materials, which don't require us to use virgin feedstocks. We can choose to make the same thing a different way, basically. And choosing not to, simply out of habit and inertia, starts to look a lot less defensible once you know that those other options exist, like all the ones that Chris and I talked about. So my challenge to you for this week is this. Next time you reach for an active ingredient to formulate with, I want you to ask yourself one question. Do you know where it actually comes from? I'm not talking about the inky name, the chemical name that's on the back of your skincare jar. I'm not talking about the supplier sustainability page. I'm talking about the actual feedstock, so the ingredient that went in to make the ingredient, basically, and the actual process. And if you don't know, try and find out, or at least acknowledge that the gap exists, because the knowledge gap is where the problem lives, and closing it is where the solution starts. Thanks for listening to my Green Beauty Opinions. Remember to visit the Formula Botanica website at formulabotanica.com to try our free online formulation course. If you haven't subscribed yet to the Green Beauty Conversations podcast, please do so now in your favorite podcast app and leave me a 5-star review if you enjoy these opinions and my discussions with my guests. I'll be back soon with my next episode.